Let's talk about how the weapon elemental damage in the first Descendant works, and more importantly, how you can get the most out of it. Now, before we jump into this, I have to make a few things clear here. First things first, what you are seeing here is my 1.0 version of all the information I've acquired, because the reality is this is pretty much uncharted territory. There is no wiki entrance which is telling you exactly how this works, or I haven't also seen really a lot of other content creators talking about this. So this is still pretty much all the things I had to figure out myself, and that means there are still some finer details missing. But with that said, I think I have now gathered all the important information to give you a very good overview on how this works. Second, this is only for the weapons in the first Descendant, because for whatever weird reason, elemental damage works differently on abilities than it actually works with the weapons you're using. I don't know why that is, I don't know why they decided to do that, but that is how it is, and that means I have to do another video for class abilities down the road. Now, the last thing is, how did I test this? I did go into the laboratory. I was running it with Ajax to make absolutely sure there is no weird class ability thing happening with the elements in the background. So I used Ajax because he is very neutral on those things. I removed all the modules from the weapons, and I tested nearly every weapon I could find in the game, besides, of course, the legendary ones and whatnot, to do those tests to make absolutely sure that there isn't like something weird maybe changing depending on which weapon you are using. And the good news is there isn't. So with that said, let's jump into weapon elemental damage. Now, how does this work? Well, the first thing you want to do is you want to check your weapon, if your weapon even does elemental damage. You can see it right here. The Tamer is using fire attack, or the Hero Scar is using toxic attack. So yes, they're using elemental damage. The next thing you want to make absolutely sure about is you want to focus on the element which is on the weapon, or the element you put there yourself through the workbench. Why do you not want to mix up elements? Well, first things first, you want to enhance the element which is already there. If you have fire attack on a weapon already, why would you try to now focus on chill enhancements, right? But the far more important point is the weapon can do multiple damage types, right? Like every attack can actually trigger multiple damage types, but it can only trigger one dot. So let's say you are running fire and you are running chill, it cannot run fire dot and the chill debuff. It cannot do both, and that has to do with how the calculation works in the background, and I will talk about that in a few minutes. So what you don't want to do is what I'm doing here, just forcing basically two elements on the weapon. That doesn't really work. Don't do that. Now, the next big question is, of course, okay, so you talk about the dots. They seem to be very important. How do I make sure that actually the weapon is proccing the dot? Well, rule of thumb here is that the faster the weapon is, the lower the proc chance is for dots. So the slower the weapon, the higher the proc chance. Or if you want to get some detailed information, make sure you're going to the weapon, hit F1, right? And then you are scrolling to attribute status effect trigger rate. And this tells you this weapon has a chance of triggering the dot per bullet is 4.35%. If you're going to a weapon which is much slower, like the sniper rifle, you can see that it is 33.33%. And there's also an attribute, by the way, which you sometimes can find on a weapon, which is increasing the status effect trigger rate by a significant amount. So try to get that if you want to go for elemental damage. Now, the next question is, of course, okay, how do the dots work exactly? And the good news is that the dots are being applied whenever you hit an enemy, right? There is a chance, as we already talked about, and we have fire, electricity, chill, and toxic. And every dot besides of chill will apply damage. So fire, let me explain that, stays for 5 seconds, does damage every 0.5 seconds, cannot be refreshed, and cannot stack. Electricity stays for 3 seconds and does damage every 0.5 seconds, does not refresh, does not stack. Chill is just applying a 1 second stun to the enemy. There is no damage component whatsoever. And then we have Toxic, same thing here, 5 seconds, 0.5 seconds, no refresh, but it can stack. And that is very important. We will talk about that in just a few seconds. So what you want to do is you want to play around the time the dot is on the enemy, right? Like, let's say the 5-second fire dot. You cannot just put another fire dot on the enemy when there is already a fire dot there. So you want to use weapons which are shooting a little bit slower than that to not, or have a much lower proc chance, so that you're not really getting into the way and wasting your procs, right? But what is also very important before we are really getting into the calculation of the dots is every enemy in the game has some sort of elemental resistance, and it really changes on the normal enemies and of course on the big colossi. Now the normal enemies, it's not too important, but for the colossi it really is, because the resistances are crazy. We talk about a difference of 1% resistance or over 50% damage resistance against elemental types. So you really want to make sure that you are not hitting that resistance, because if you're going for elemental damage, you will lose so much and you will be useless for your group when you are fighting against the colossi. So please make sure that you are hitting the right resistances for those boss fights. For the normal enemies, not too important. They die still very quickly, but still something to keep an eye on. Now, let's talk about the dots. How are they calculated? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Let's just take a normal proc. You hit the enemy, you do 1000 damage. It procs. Now for the next 5 seconds, let's say with fire, you will do 500 damage every 0.5 second. So 50% of the damage which proc the dot is being calculated for the dot. Okay, how does that work with Toxic? Because you can stack Toxic, and also how high can you stack Toxic? Well, I haven't really found a limit yet. There might be one, but if you are alone or even with 2 players, chances are very high that you are not going over 10 stacks, and 10 stacks is something you can definitely reach. But everything beyond that, I haven't really seen yet, and I didn't have enough players to really check out how high you can actually stack it. But what happens if you stack Toxic? Well, let's do the example again. You do 1000 damage. You will now do 500 damage every 0.5 seconds. The next stack is coming, and that is 25% damage on top from the damage you did to proc the dot. So in this case, 250 extra damage. So now your dot is doing 750 damage. Another stack, 1000 damage. Another stack, 1250 damage, right? You get the idea. It's always 25% more damage. But, and this goes again for every dot, they can apply crits and headshots. Yes, that counts. So let's say you do 2000 damage, which was a crit. You will now actually do 1000 damage every 0.5 seconds. Okay, cool, that's nice. But wait, how does that work with Toxic? Let's say your first shot is a crit, but your second shot isn't. How's that calculated? Well, they actually decided to make it easy on themselves, and they would just take for the calculation the first damage you did, and in this case it was a crit. So that means Your first shot is a crit, 1000 damage every 0.5 seconds. Second shot, which is applying another stack, is not a crit. Doesn't matter, you still get 500 extra damage now. It will always go with the damage you use to apply the dot. That's how it stacks, and that's how insane toxic damage can be, right? Because if you were running a crit build and you really build that up, it's just a lot. But that's how it works. That's how all the dot and elemental damage works. As I said, look out for the resistances. They make a huge differences. There are enemies who have only 1% resistance, and then there are enemies who have 30% resistance, 37% resistance, or 50% resistance. Like, it makes a huge difference. And I would definitely make another video down the road about elemental ability damage, because for whatever weird reason, it's a different sort of dot, and it doesn't work together with your weapon elemental damage. It's weird as hell, let me tell you that. But I hope that was helpful. If you still have any questions, or maybe I will also put like some of the calculations down below in the video description, so you can see actually some of the examples if you're curious. Let me know down below in the comments if you still have anything to say. And with that said, thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to leave a like, and also if you're new to the channel, you want to see more RPGs and survival games I'm focusing on, you might want to consider to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.